All right, thank you very much, Anthony, for that introduction. And thank you also for this really interesting and I should say very well organized series. We're here today to think through the meaning of climate change. We're also here to celebrate Dipesh Chakrabarty, who joins me, his new book, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, which I would encourage you all to get and read. I just want to also say welcome to everyone who is here. From Saudi Arabia, from Germany, from Rio and Brazil, from London. I would like for this to be our shared forum for thinking through the meaning of climate change. Today, of course, with somebody who has been thinking about this for some time. So I want to, Dipesh, we're just meeting for the first time here, but I've been reading your work for some time. So I want to engage you on some questions about your new book, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. I guess, you know, in addition to all of your work that you did in your earlier career on globalization and post-colonial theory, I would say many people broadly know you today, and they assign your text, your 2009 article, The Climate of History. I think they do this because very early on, you were reading scientific journals on the idea of an Anthropocene, or the idea that humans had become a geological force on the planet. In this new book, you know, you go beyond just introducing into the humanities concepts like geological force or deep history. You start to periodize our era as a planetary age. So I'd like to begin there by asking you what you mean by a planetary age. What's this planetary age in which we're living?
Thank you, Travis, for your question. It's wonderful to meet you for the first time on screen. And also I take this opportunity to thank Anthony for inviting both of us to discuss my book, and also to welcome people assembled online. What do I mean by planetary age? So, well, the most simple answer would be that if you went back to what we mostly talked about and what newspapers mostly talked about and media mostly talked about, let's say 20 years ago, you wouldn't get a great deal on global warming or climate change, even though the IPCC had been set up 1988 or 89. It so happened that a respected historian from Harvard, Charles Meyer, was or he wrote, I don't know if he was invited to write, it may have been an invited article. He wrote an essay called, excuse me, called Consigning the 20th Century to History in the American Historical Review in 2000. So probably the last issue, definitely the last year. So he was, as a historian, taking kind of a, view of the entire century. And he mentioned most things that you would think about, from the two wars and the decolonization, end of empire, all kinds of issues, actually. But there wasn't a word about climate change. Whereas by the time you come to 2015 or 16, the historian late Chris Bailey's second volume of his Making of the Modern World was published. And there is indeed a chapter or a few pages on climate change in the Anthropocene. So clearly, what's been happening in the last 20 years is because of daily news that we consume either through newspapers or online or television. We've all become aware of global warming as a phenomenon, or climate change as a phenomenon. And we've all experienced erratic or extreme weather events, and which have been discussed in the media. But if you think about just the expressions we use these days, renewable versus non-renewable fuel, excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, sea levels rising, the oceans warming up, climate refugees, or glaciers melting, you realize that we are, whether we think about it or not, we are talking about processes that exceed what happens with human institutions. We're actually talking about this planet. And we are talking sometimes unconsciously and unawares of the distinction between human time and the time it requires the planet to do certain things. So let's say the distinction between renewable and non-renewable fossils. Now, if human beings were able to hang around for another 200 million years or 300 million years, the planet might be able to make fossil fuels again. So when we describe fossil fuels as non-renewable, we're talking about the distinction between the time in which human institutions work and the time over which the planet works sometimes, right? So in a way, or let's talk about take the expression excess carbon dioxide. And sometimes I go into a classroom and ask students, so in relationship to what is carbon dioxide in excess? What does the in excess bit mean? And sometimes they know, sometimes they don't, but I have to explain to them that if we didn't do anything and there was all this carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, the planet would process all those gases in its own time. But it might not do it quickly enough for us to remain unaffected by the warming effect it produces. So in effect, we either want to rush the planet along and say, hey, look, hurry up, absorb all that carbon dioxide quicker, can't you do it? It's like how you sort of, say to a horse, giddy up, or say to a taxi driver, can you go more faster, please? But the planet sometimes, the planet doesn't listen to us and go faster. But my sense is that if you think about the latest period of globalization as kind of spanning the last 2 decades of the 20th century, and I say the last 2 decades was because you can go a little bit further. Let's go back to Chinese modernization, late 70s. Indian liberalization of the Indian economy. We usually date it from 1991, right? The last 3 decades, let's say. Then we talked about humans, their institutions, intra-human questions of justice, questions of immigration, racism, migrancy as a mode of human existence, as my friend Homi Bhabha would write about in his 1994 classic book, The Location of Culture. But today we actually talk about not just those institutions, but what the planet does. And to lesser or greater degrees, in uneven ways, we are becoming aware of certain geobiological changes that are happening to the planet. Species extinction we hear about, right? So the history of life, we hear about the viruses, all the viruses that are waiting in the wings, as it were, as we destroy jungles. So by a planetary age, what I mean to say is that, that we used to think of ourselves as inhabiting a global age, but it seems to me we're on the cusp of the global and something I've begun to call the planetary age, where human concerns embrace and include kind of processes that would have been in the past domain of specialist knowledge.
I think that's probably very helpful for people to understand that as a basic concept. The planetary, as you say, decenters the human. So we can see this line of division in the new book. On the one hand, we have human concepts and human histories, human institutions. And on the other hand, we have planetary concepts, planetary institutions. Well, I don't know if you can speak of institutions, but you can definitely speak of data and metrics. Yeah.
Right.
So I guess going along with this, I want to take a step back and ask about how you got into this, because, as a scholar of capitalism, post-colonial theory, someone who grew up in Calcutta and I think set out to write, in some ways about those experiences, you say that your readings in those areas did not really prepare you for this encounter with the planetary. And then you write in the book that in 2003, that wildfires in Australia had destroyed places and habitats that you'd come to love there while you were a graduate student. And you write that after this experience of wildfires, you had something like a feeling of falling into deep history, into the abyss of deep geological time. You tried to figure out, you write, how to add to your research on colonialism, globalization, or human history, as you put it, a set of historical concerns that were of a different time scale or chronology. So layering in a certain way, the time of the Anthropocene with now the time of globalization or global capital. I wanted to ask if you could talk more about the fires as a turning point in your career, in part because I noticed that you dedicate the new book to victims of the Australian wildfire in 2019 and 2020, a different wildfire, in which, you know, the whole world seemed to be watching an entire continent on fire.
Well, I mean, I will address all of those questions, but just to begin with, let me make a point which we can take up later in the discussion, which is that for me, the global and planetary, they do not constitute a binary division. Is what I argue in the book is that it is the intensification of globalization, the intensification of global capitalism that and the technology that goes along with it, that opens up to us what I call the domain of the planetary. In other words, it is that intensification that brings all that geological knowledge back into the everyday life of the citizen.
Yes,
it spills beyond the expertise of the geologists, for instance. We can come back to that question later.
Well, it's something like conceptual distinction that doesn't make a binary. And you insist on, as you say, the language of rendering as layered. Seeing these as...
Exactly. So these are connected. These are not sort of unconnected. So yes, I grew up in, you know, I am like Rushdie, born a few years after him, but one of those famous Midnight's children, if you think of an extended midnight. And so I grew up with these issues of poverty. Just empire was a very recent memory. My parents' generation had grown up through it. So we used to hear about British imperialism and what it did to India. And grew up through 1975, the second wave feminism, when UN actually declared it as Women's Year. And that introduced actually a lot of new feminist ideas into India, and eventually I became a post-colonial scholar. I was one of the founding editors of Subaltern Studies, looking at what socially subordinate groups of people do to resist mightier entities, whether it's an institution or the state or an empire. So yes, I was very much focused on this question of agency of the small human person, and that's really the way that the word agency came into history writing in the 1960s and 70s, popularized by very famous English historians like E.P. Thompson or Eric Hobsbawm, who also happened to be my PhD examiner, by the way. And you know, and these are all people I considered, they were the heroes of my history world. And Thompson in particular I loved. But you see, there are two English words that come into social science, having originated, I think, initially in the domain of commerce. So one is interest, and we talk about now self-interest and, you know, collective interest. The other one is agency. So long before we had this conception of agency, which meant your autonomy, your capacity to project yourself outwards into the future, to make a purposeful intervention in the world that we call politics. I mean, there was still the agent as your representative, the shipping agent, who could represent you, right? Your agent in that sense. But when I came across scientists saying that human beings have become a geological agent transforming the world, or a geological force, the word agency didn't carry the same meaning. Because when I work as a political agent, or when I write my own diary, or I write a novel, or you write poems, and when you say I write, I'm a poet, there's a certain sense of agency which is about your sense of your own sovereignty, or if not sovereignty, autonomy of yourself, right, on yourself. But a geological agent here meant that our collective impact could be something like a huge volcanic eruption that changes the climate of the whole planet, or like the asteroid strike that, let's say, people argue led to the extinction of the dinosaurs, right? So that's a kind of sense of agency that you can't really grasp experientially. And see, when people write history, remember that I'm by training a historian. Normally in history writing, we assume a continuity of human experience. So if I told you that a king was angry, I don't have to explain what being angry is, because as humans, we know what being angry is. I can even say that the lion was angry, and you will understand what I mean by it, right? Because being angry is something which is part of our experience of being human for a long time. But this capacity for experiencing the world, the apparatus that, you know, the biophysical apparatus that we all are individually, that we're able to experience the world, the idea of being collectively being a geological agent or a geological force was something that was cognitively graspable. It's like I could use my intelligence to understand what it meant by giving those examples, but it's not something that I grasp experientially. And therefore I thought, oh, what kind of history is this? Now, clearly, geologists have been writing this history for a long time. Evolutionary biologists have been writing this history for a long time. But these are histories that, in writing history of the Renaissance or the Reformation or the Enlightenment, this we take for granted. You know, there was an old English biologist, J.B.S. Haldane, who died in India, wonderful, wonderful biologist, and really an enormously learned man. And he had a book called Everything Has a History. The mountains have a history. But when I read him initially, I was reading him through the lens of the English philosopher Collingwood, who always argued that things have chronology, only humans have history. You know, he would say that if you urinate, that's just a biological function. Animals also do it. That has chronology. But if your urination leads to some social action, you know, make somebody angry, it's an act of sacrilege or something, then it's history for humans. So my conception of what history was, having been a student of Collingwood or Carr, was being challenged by this notion of humans being collectively geological. And that's why I felt that I wasn't dismissing my knowledge. I wasn't saying my knowledge was of no use that I'd learned so far, but I said, I need to supplement this. I mean, something needs to be added to what I already know. In order to bring this within the fold of humanities, in order to understand it, that's how I kept working. There was no model for it. So I actually was learning and making mistakes along the way. And in this book, in some ways, portrays part of the journey. There are many things I left out of the book. I mean, I gave the Tanner lectures in 2015, but I took some bits of that in this book because a lot I left out because I had kind of grown out of what I was thinking in 2015, because I was constantly reading Earth system scientists and friends in other areas, and they were helping me to correct my wrong notions or wrong impressions. So yes, but that's what I meant by the paragraph you were pointing to.
Yeah. Well, I think that's getting to the heart of an issue that I'm trying to draw out, which is precisely how we experience these events of climate change as part of our species. And it's a problem that I want to talk a little bit more about history and historiography a little later, and how, you know, what exactly you're a student of and what needs to be supplemented.
Mm-hmm.
In philosophy, we typically think of this, you know, experience or historically based philosophy through kinds of phenomenology, which you reference fairly often, actually, in the book. And I was interested in this in two sort of different ways. The first is, you rightly point out that we never can have an experience of ourselves as a species. We can never have an experience of something like ourselves as a population of 8 billion, you know, human beings, or an entire Earth system on the brink, or a geological timescale that outlasts our species. It's just not possible to have an experience of that. So an experience-based model of doing philosophy or doing, you know, a kind of perception fails. But additionally, the way that we've been trained to do history or philosophy also misleads us, because they're all anchored in human perception. So they're not really up to the task of explaining these phenomena as such. You call this, you know, the problem of structures of mutuality, where we can only think geological phenomena through the lens of human beings. The philosopher Kimpton Miyasu has called this correlation. So I wanted to ask, you know, how do we describe something like a planetary history that we can't make sense of experientially. Um, and the reason I say this is because it seems to me somewhat ironic that it was only, or it seems to be, as you say in the book, this experience of 2003 Australian wildfires that really made you make a turning point in the history of your career. In other words, I'm trying to get at the issue of not just conceptually, how we deal with this problem or methodologically, but also what does it take for people to somehow make a turning point in the way that they think.
Right. So there's two questions there. I'll come to the turning point. I mean, how it became a turning point. And I completely take your point about layering, because in some ways, to the extent that we get being geological or being planetary, within ourselves is only to the extent that it can be captured by the experiential aspects of life, and I'll come to it. But remember that. But going back to phenomenology, I mean, phenomenology has been, or phenomenological thinking, or being a student of phenomenology, has been quite central to my work from the time I was working on Provincializing Europe, which came out in 2000. And even the proposition I put to you that historical writing depends on the assumption of a continuity of experience is not original to myself. It's actually, Gadamer says it in Truth and Method in his discussion of history. So I was actually taking it from a phenomenologist in putting it to you. And when I was working on Provincializing Europe, and because I was never a cultural relativist, or the way the expression was used to denounce people who were seen as postmodernists or something in the 80s and 90s. I was never that. I always believed in there being something universal or shared between human beings. And actually, when I made Marx's category capital, not the universal that it's meant to be, but I made it historical, the ground on which I kind of situated myself was phenomenological. In a sense, I was reading Heidegger and those people and say that, okay, now in the language which I would speak today, I'd probably say that the apparatus by which we humans experience the world has a much older history than modern human institutions. So it's older than capitalism. So the fact that we have opposable thumbs or binocular vision, I mean, human institutions or human artifacts would take that for granted, right? And even as a post-colonial thinker, when I read Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Masks, and saw how much he actually owed to Merleau-Ponty, phenomenology of perception, to argue from his point of view about race, that saying a black man has no corporeal schema. In other words, the black man can't ever forget that he or she is black, a black person, right? So in some ways, that kind of legitimized my phenomenological thinking. I thought, okay, if Frantz Fanon is thinking with both phenomenology and history as a post-colonial thinker, I can do that. What happens in this book is really, in some ways, my sense of the limits of phenomenological thinking began to emerge from this work. And I began to see, and I actually went back to reading J.B.S. Haldane again. And he has a wonderful essay that he published around 1926, if not in 1976, I don't exactly remember, called Being the Right Size. And where he was actually talking about, he was talking about the proportionality of the body, but he was talking about how much our perceptions are, and how we think about the world, how we imagine our futures. There's a kind of proportionality to the time span of your existence. So when we build a human institution, when we think about who I will save for, how far back will I remember people in my life, there is a kind of a human sense of time, which changes, of course, with sort of increased longevity and things, but still it's covered 3 generations or 4 generations. You might have some vague idea of ancestors. These days, with it increases with DNA studies and things. But there's a difference between that and the time scale over which the planet works. And and what, as Earth system science was developing. So you remember Earth system science is itself a relatively recent science. So NASA put together its committee on Earth system science around 1983. And it was itself a multidisciplinary science, sort of people in different branches coming together. One of the things in the way it challenged my sort of historical thinking was around the word modern. So, you know, as a historian of modernity, I mean, if I use the word modern, in India, I think about the advent of British rule onwards. Maybe in Europe, I would think about Renaissance onwards, or at the most, I might go back to classical Greeks and say, okay, that's when it begins. But it's few thousand years. When Earth system scientists were explaining in their books written for people like ourselves, the nature of the modern atmosphere, which was that this atmosphere was able to maintain oxygen at a certain level, which ensured that the forest all did not go up in smoke, and creatures, oxygen-dependent creatures, didn't choke to death. So they said this is the atmosphere is not always like that. This is the modern atmosphere of the planet, and they call it modern because it's like the latest atmosphere, and this has been doing it. And I read the word modern, and then I thought, whoa, so how old is modern? And they said 375 million years. Right? For a historian like myself to stumble across the word modern in a geologist's book and to see modern is 375 million years, you realize that modern has no reference to humans, right? And it also made me realize that this air we breathe and without which we can't exist was not necessarily made or even maintained with us in view. So when I looked at the planetary processes, and through these kind of sciences like evolutionary biology or earth system science, you almost, by the logic of those disciplines, you get decentered because we come so late in the story of the planet that we can't be its protagonists. Whereas the story of globalization, the story of capitalism, is really what humans have done to take our technology, our, you know. So that's the that's the distinction I was beginning to make. I thought, wow. So really, I mean, even though they're connected, but they are like two different vantage points from which to have different perspectives on our history.
So we have these different timescales or chronologies.
That they come together, as I was saying.
Yes. And one of the problems, I guess, that you've had to encounter from your critics is that by even entertaining or even thinking through the timescale of the planetary, some people wonder whether that emphasizes the geological at the expense of all of these human histories that we have, that you worked on, race, class, colonial history, etc. And it's a difficult, problem to think through. I guess this becomes especially important when one attempts to locate the birth of the Anthropocene or births of the Anthropocene. One tries to give a historiography of it. When somebody is attempting to explain how the planet got to this point, over the modern, over hundreds of millions of years or something, and that humans came so late to the story, some still say it only makes sense to begin by differentiating between the carbon emissions of the global north versus the global south, or the rich versus the poor, the rest of the planet and the footprint of the US and Great Britain, et cetera. You disagree. Can you talk about why that is?
Yeah. So first of all, I have to clarify, I don't disagree. I mean, I actually say that to the extent one is talking about historical responsibility for emissions of greenhouse gases, clearly these differences are very important. And as an Indian, I have to remember that the two kind of activist scholars who pushed the Rio conference, 1991 Rio conference, to adopt, to divide the world's nations into two annexures, under the Montreal Protocol, so that per capita emissions were calculated. There were two Indian scholars, Sunita Agarwal and Sunita Narayan and Anil, the late Anil Agarwal, who actually produced a book called, a leaflet called Global Warming in an Unequal World, an example of environmental colonialism or something. So they were clearly thinking through the history of colonialism, third worldism, all of those things. Secondly, I also have to say that the global north and the global south are not two blocks. Every nation has a bit of the global north. and a bit of the global south in it. So it's a division that runs through the world. It's not like, and I actually, even in the first article I actually wrote that we have come into this through capitalism, and this will accentuate the inequalities of capitalism. So I had no disagreement. The problem was I spoke about species.
Yeah.
and I had a short sentence saying there are no lifeboats for the rich in this, or something like that, which people didn't like. So again, what happens in the humanities sometimes is that if you don't like one critical sentence, the entire things get banned. and some of the criticism was of that nature, which I'm used to. That's what happens in the humanities. Humanities was meant to be all about closed reading, but we have to read so many things these days that it's very hard to closely read anything. So you skim read, and then you have one sentence which kind of which irritates you, and then boom, it goes. So first of all, I have to say that I don't disagree on that particular question. But what sometimes these critics don't see is the history of how complicit other nations and other classes have been in the even geographical south or outside of Europe to join this game, the game of capitalism, game of industrial civilization, in spite of there having been a Mahatma Gandhi or even critics in the West, or also people who have actually not liked the West, the industrial civilization that we've created. But think of Japan, which industrializes without having to be without undergoing colonialism. I mean, Japan clearly decides in the 19th century that this is the way to be. I mean, and has the longest running translation projects for translating Western thought from medicine to science to philosophy. And even today, Japan works as a huge translation machine. Think of Deng Xiaoping's Chinese modernization. And this happens after the Club of Rome report had come out, Limits of Growth, 1972. And Deng decides in 1978 that the only way to pull millions of Chinese out of poverty was to develop some kind of capitalism, right? India goes that way. So what sometimes these people don't look at is how much the aspirations of the rising middle classes of third world nations are caught up in what we call global capitalism. I'll just give you simple figures. I mean, from what I remember, I think there's a Hoover Institution report, and a German scholar cites them. So in the year 2000, 70% of the world's consuming classes, people who buy household gadgets and stuff, came from the usual suspect list of countries, North America, Western Europe, Japan, the industrialized wealthy countries. Today, 70% come from China, India, Brazil, some places in Africa, right? And these rising global middle classes. Now, whether this is sustainable in the long run is a different question. Whether this will make the global warming problem worse is a different question. But in my book, as you know, I tell the story of poorer people in Delhi buying air conditioners, cheap air conditioners, which are bad for the atmosphere. And when there was a meeting of all global nations in 2016 in Rwanda, a place called Kigali, to make a world deal, kind of global deal about air conditioners and phasing the bad ones out. India bargained hard to be in the outermost ring, to be among the countries to change at the slowest possible pace. Because air conditioners are very popular. Because all the cities are becoming heat islands. And you see people, and sometimes poor people are pooling money and buying an air conditioner for a room they share. And when they've been interviewed by journalists, and I have a colleague, Michael Greenstone, in my economics department, who's worked on this air conditioning problem in Delhi, they will tell you that the air conditioner meant for the first time they've had a good night's sleep. It's increased their sense of well-being. The children are able to do well with school exams or wanting to get into medical school or whatever, they're aspirational for the aspirational people. And clearly they're making a trade-off. They're actually heating up Delhi even more. But their gamble is when Delhi becomes really uninhabitable, their children will be educated enough to go to some other place, right? So in a way, the race to join the middle classes for them is also a race to beat global warming generationally through movement and migration. While it may not add up to a good for the world, but that is happening.
Yes, this is one of the more interesting aspects of the book is how the book challenges this notion that somehow our environmental crises began in Europe, that is a Eurocene. Um, Whether in philosophy, because it's a European way of life, and I'm thinking here of the work of Bruno Latour and others, or whether it's a European history and it's linked to the history of colonization of the Americas, for instance, and the way that this, set out in a certain way, or if it's linked to Europe itself, like we think about coal emissions, and usually that story is told beginning in England. Um, but all of these examples, you talk about Nehru's mystical obsession with damming the Himalayas, or Modi taking inspiration from the Vedas for
Right.
largely coal-inspired development schemes.
Right.
You say that that indicates a separate third world desire for energy-intensive, mostly coal-driven modernization, and that's
And
this
well-being, and for
and
humans
well-being.
to, and well-being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that in a way, that's the sense that the Anthropocene needs to be provincialized, or at least de-Europeanized.
But here's my point. See, the reason why, so when I started this work, obviously I used to talk about the Anthropocene, and the Anthropocene is what really the idea of the Anthropocene got me into this work. The idea that a geological epoch being named after us, are we that big? That's what that sense of surprise got me into it. And of course, the word Anthropocene has been a debated word right from the beginning. It's been debated by geologists themselves. And then it's been debated by social scientists. I don't think there's been any other geological periodizing moniker that's been debated so much by people who are not geologists at all. Right? I mean, historians have weighed in, sociologists have weighed in, everybody's weighed in on this. So there's almost a crowdsourcing going on for the name of a geological epoch. What's undeniable is the amount of evidence they have amassed to document human impact on the planet. But see, here's the interesting thing about the debate in the social sciences. So yeah, some people say 1610, the Orbe spike and the colonization of Latin America. Some people say race, and look at race and the role of race in doing it. But if you look at the debate among geologists, so there are three groups that I was able to identify. There's Bill Ruddiman and his group at Princeton, who were arguing that it begins with the invention of agriculture. So if everybody accepted that, there would be no debate about capitalism, right? Then there are people like Andrew Glikson, a geologist in Australia, and many others who would rather have this term being informal. And there are informal terms in geology, like snowball earth or hothouse earth, without formalizing it. And Andrew Glikson argues, some of his colleagues too, that Anthropocene, that there's an ancient Anthropocene which begins with hominin capacity to manage fire, because that's when a species has more energy available to it than can be produced through sheer muscle power. So they think of an ancient, medieval, and modern Anthropocene, or ancient, middle, and modern Anthropocene. And then there are stratigraphers in the Anthropocene working group who argue that it's from the 1950s. And once they date in, because of the last group, which is the most influential perhaps, they date it from the 1950s, that date has a sociogenesis, because they talk about nuclear fallout. People can then easily go back and say, hey, before there's nuclear fallout, there's all these other power structures. There's Cold War, there's human history, etc. So the whole shebang comes in of human history and differentiated history, and that's true. But what I'm saying is, if technically geologists said 10,000 years ago or 11,700, we as social scientists wouldn't have much to say, right? So now the genie is out of the bottle. And there's a very interesting book by Jan Zalasevich and Mark Williams from the Anthropocene Working Group, and my close friend and dear friend Julia Edney Thomas, who's a historian, like John McNeil, who's joined them. And the three of them have authored a book and recently published an article trying to produce a common ground on which all the disagreements would be situated. But I kind of think that's not how things work in the humanities. I mean, humanists thrive on disagreements. See, in the sciences, every agreement is hard won. right? I mean, whereas in the humanities, we don't even look for it. We look for like-minded people, but then together we form a camp, and we argue against some other group who form a camp, and that's how people in the humanities thrive. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but that's the mode of operation. Uh, so, so sometimes I find the scientists saying, okay, let there be two kinds of Anthropocenes, one for us scientists and one for you guys. You can do with it whatever you want.
Well, it just goes to show the arguments about which golden spike do you emphasize,
Right. So
or
basically,
what name is it? A capitalist scene, Donna Haraway, or a plantationist scene?
but you see, what I realized is that, see, Anthropocene names a geological epoch. An epoch, which is the smallest unit in geological period, but an epoch itself could be 20 million years, 10 million years. So it's well possible that whatever is this epoch, whether you call it Anthropocene, Capitalocene, might outlast humans. Whereas that's why I developed the idea of the planetary, which is a perspective that we have to take on ourselves now. So my idea of the planet is a human-related perspectival point of view, which decenters us. And therefore, it's of here and now. It doesn't outlast the humans. If humans go, my planetary goes. But all I'm saying is that we are willy-nilly getting entangled with the planet. We're having to think about how the planet works. We are debating, should we geoengineer the planet? Should we withdraw, like E.O. Wilson says, half Earth? Let's kind of withdraw and leave some of the land areas and other spaces for other species. But the very fact that we're debating that shows that we are getting entangled with this question of how to manage this planet, how to live on this planet. What is this planet? Earth system. Is it a system? Does it work like a system? Are geology and biology connected? So for me, that's a perspectival position available to humans now as we think through the problem. Whereas the Anthropocene names a period that may well outlast humans. It's not even though it's ironical, it's got the name Anthropos in it. And once, Jan Jalasevich wrote to me saying, Dipesh, would it have been easier for people to understand it if it had been named after rats? Because the word anthropos has been so confusing and so contested. And it gave rise to this differentiated history and things. But so ironically, it calls itself the Anthropocene, but it's actually looking at a period that may well go on beyond human existence.
Yeah.
And that's why I feel that it's not human, it's not even decentering humans because it's not human-centered. Whereas my planetary is ultimately human-related. It's about decentering of humans, but it's about the decentering that we have to do of ourselves. The planet doesn't do it. It's a vantage point. And that's why I shifted gradually from focusing on the Anthropocene. And I felt that it was taking into debates where the points were known to me. I mean, I know that the world is differentiated. I know that there are rich, poor. I know there's racism. I've grown up working through all those issues. So it was not giving me, it was giving me a morally right point, but it was not giving me any new issues to think about. And I don't even disagree with them. So I moved to the planetary, thinking that I was finding the global and the planetary as perspectival points, connected but different, a more generative sort of question to work through.
Well, there's a lot to think about there in terms of, the Anthropocene and the name, the geological turn, species thinking, where you get in trouble, and how you have credibility on it too, because you're somebody who has thought through these issues of how human beings have been differentiated through human histories. But I want to make sure that we have time for some questions. And there's a really interesting question here from Georgina Jones. She says Georgina says in the blurb to Dipesh's book, it says that he is one of the most influential scholars addressing the meaning of climate change. And Georgina is asking us to talk a little bit more about the meaning of climate change. And I have to say I'm interested in that too, for a number of reasons. I think one question I've had is that, beyond all of the catastrophes that may be coming, what are coming, there's also maybe some possibilities about whether the Anthropocene or the planetary, as we could give it a new name, has the potential to collectivize or historicize people, specifically when it's been, somewhat difficult to promote any kind of solidarity. There's this idea that you initially presented in the climate of history essay, which is that there's this shared catastrophe that has the potential to collectivize us, our species. Have you thought, I mean, obviously, but has your thinking changed in terms of, the meaning of climate change, whether it be politics or whether it be something like deep history? What's the meaning of climate change in a nutshell?
Well, I mean, in a nutshell, since I was thinking not of what it might mean to individuals, because that varies from one part of the world to another. I first wrote this climate of history piece in my own mother tongue, Bengali, or Bangla, as we call it, before I wrote it up in English, and nobody was interested. I published it, and all my friends said, "It's just Western problems. We don't worry about these things." Well, now they do, but then they didn't. It was 2008. So the macro meaning is, maybe I can explain it to going back to Hannah Arendt's book on the human condition, which was published in around 1958. And she was writing it, when she was writing it, the Russians sent the Sputnik up, the first Sputnik.
Yeah.
And she was writing under the shadow of that sudden opening up of space. And she wrote, towards the end of the book, she writes, look, this means that humans will be able to ensure the survival of the species by migrating to other celestial bodies. This might mean Earth alienation, alienation from what we belong to, but that's how the human condition is changed. And in many ways, as I was writing the book, I had this feeling that the human condition has changed again, not in the direction of ensuring the survival of the species, but actually in the direction of being impeded by our own expansion. In fact, the current pandemic, as Anthony Fauci, the famous American doctor in charge of infectious diseases until recently, kept saying, not just in his speeches, but also in academic papers he was publishing with a colleague called David Morans, that the pandemic partly indicated that we are in an era of pandemics where the probability of frequent pandemics is high, because we are cutting down forests and bringing wildlife close to us, so that 70% of new infectious diseases in the last 20 years are zoonotic, coming from wildlife to us. And so he was pointing to the, not Anthropocene, but the global environmental crisis as the main reason, but which had to do with expansion of the human domain. So what's happened is, if you look at our history, so we almost took Homo sapiens 300,000 years to get to the number 1 billion. So in 1900, even as recent as 1900, we were 1.6 billion. By the end of the century, 2000, we are 6 billion. So we increased about 4 times. And today we are 8 going on to 9, 10, whatever, right? It's only 20 years have gone by since 2000.
11 to 14 billion, yeah, by the end of the century.
Yeah, so this has really been the period of human flourishing. We have lived well. I mean, even there's been mass poverty, but also there's been mass consumption. And China has pulled millions out of poverty. There's no question. India probably has too. So humans have flourished like they've never before. And it's like today we are presented with the bill for that flourishing. And so we have to decide which way we go, and which way we go will depend on our debates and things. My hope is, because humans are a learning species, that we'll learn from our mistakes. But the meaning of climate change for me is that we have to look at ourselves not simply in terms of our criticisms of institutions, which we've been doing for at least 200 years, which is still important. But at the same time, but of all those discussions, we are at the center. Humans are the protagonists, as I say, the story of globalization. But when you take the planetary perspective, it decenters you. And it reminds you, actually, which is something good to be reminded of in an era of pandemics, that humans are a minority form of life. The majority forms of life, both by weight and numbers I read, are microbial. are bacteria, viruses, things you can't even see. And it's them and the forms of life that we normally consider inferior, like plants or planktons in the oceans, that actually keep supplying the air with the oxygen it needs and keeps the mansion of life going. So if you think of life as a multi-storied building, then these lower creatures that is keeping the building running, and we are in the top floor somewhere forgetful of it. So sometimes I say to students, we are a bit like whites in South Africa during the apartheid years, a dominant minority making the life of majority hell. and we have to learn to live otherwise. We don't have to give up on what we value, but I think we need to think about scaling them differently.
Hmm. So I hear you mention, yeah, please. I hear you mentioning two things. First, it's interesting, I think, that you begin with Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition and the opening sort of discussion that she has about Sputnik and saying, is this some sort of departure from the world? She being a thinker of the world. And it reminds me of the cover of the book here. I'm just holding it up, which is the Earth, the planet seen from the perspective of outer space. And so maybe it's just also a shift in perspective in the way we look at things. And the other thing I hear you mentioning too is that you bring up often is that in addition to all of these human differentiations, race, empire, capital, and so on, you really do think about the problem of population. And this, going back to what we were talking about before, the problem of sheer numerousness, of sheer, numbers. It reminds me a little bit of the pandemic and the science surrounding it. It's like the rural-urban divide. We had the pandemic very early on in here where I'm at in New York City, but in the countryside where my parents lived, they didn't really have an experience of it. They didn't know anyone who had been affected by it. And so, I guess I'm often just interested in, the ways in which we'll never have a view from the outer space, or we'll never, maybe understand at our site 8 billion or potentially 14 billion, from 2 billion in 1950 to maybe 14 billion by the end of the century. We'll never have that experience, but there does seem to be coming a broader, or even happening now, in our art and our thought, a broader cultural shift from the individual to the collective, from our own immediate experiences to some kind of expansive histories that include rocks and other elements, and then microbes, bacteria and viruses.
No, completely. Actually, the pandemic is raging through India. And in the last 1 month, I've lost friends. I have friends who are in hospital at the moment, and some of them struggling for life. Every day, we hear of deaths of somebody we know or somebody we know knows. So the pandemic is very real at the moment in my life, and I've got family in India, and I'm worried for them. But see, this is where Fauci actually says that we have to take a long-term view of this too, just as we take a short-term view and produce vaccines. But are we going to belong to a civilization where we'll have series of pandemics and we'll just keep producing vaccines and increase the number of shots we have to take every year and lose some people every year? But if this is being produced by the expansion of the kind of civilization we've got, we have to think somewhere down the line of not doing that which is producing the pandemic, which is producing these risks for our civilization, without giving up on things we value. But as I said, but scale them differently, and population is part of the problem of scaling in that sense.
And the pandemic is happening all over the world at the same time as it's happening locally. There's one last question I wanted to ask you, which is on the question of something like a universal in terms of the meaning of climate change that was raised. You mentioned, I think rightly, and I came from the same background when we were studying the humanities in the wake of post-structural criticisms. You were trained to be extremely suspicious of all claims of universalism, all claims of totality. Is there something about the meaning of climate change that invites, again, the question of the universal? I'm thinking of here of recent debates on it. But this is when I think about the meaning of climate change, I also think about this idea of things becoming collective and historicized, even a post-human notion of the universal. But is that something that you think about? I know that word very interestingly occurred frequently, going way back to your early essay in 2009. And you think about it in a differentiated way, but nevertheless, you're thinking of a universal very early on.
Sure. I mean, Anthony's already warned me to make my answers short, so I'll keep this short. I do think about the universal, and I think there exist universals. I think evolution produces certain universals in us. But I think universals can lead both ways. I can use a universal to oppress you. I make a slave out of a human, not out of a dog. And here I find the African thinker Achille Mbembe's idea of actually looking for what's in common rather than the universal very helpful and productive. And maybe I shouldn't take up any more time, but Achille Mbembe has a collection of essays that's come out recently called Out of the Dark Night. And he has an essay which has the word proximity in its title, and this is where he discusses it. So I'll give the reference and expand on it if needed, but let me stop here and maybe take more questions if we have time.
Yes, there's a particular question that some folks want to be asked by Maximilian Hepak. Maximilian, if you could please post the question again. I'm just having trouble finding it. Great. I was wondering, Maximilian Hepak asks, I was wondering how you relate extreme weather events, which we experience, to climate change, which is taking place on a global scale and is commonly considered to be beyond experience.
Okay, I can now see the question. Yeah, climate, well, I mean, again, the Australian fires are a good case in point, or Hurricane Katrina, or many of these issues around the world. And events, the particular events we experience always have a combination of planetary history and human history. Sometimes building laws are violated. People build in areas where they shouldn't be building. Or people in India build over sort of river courses that the rivers have abandoned. But then when the rivers have, there's a mountain river in flood, it kind of reclaims that course and causes havoc. So I would say that planetary climate system, which is what we call it, is a construction of satellite measurements, of boring into deep ice for ancient air bubbles, computer models. It's a human construction. It doesn't exist as an object. So it's more like what Timothy Morton calls a hyper object, something that doesn't quite exist as an object, but has the impact of an object. So you can't experience it. But on the other hand, it definitely exacerbates weather events. So when we talk about extreme over weather event, it's like they're trying to divide it up into the components and see if they can actually create models in which you can distribute responsibility. But so what we experience is very much what we can experience: a huge firestorm, sudden floods. So those are within human experience. Human beings have always experienced them. But it's really their frequency. So it's really how we measure them statistically. Their frequency, the scale of their incidence, the unseasonality, all that is pointing to changes in the global planetary system. It's not warming up at the same pace everywhere. Even the seas aren't. Its actual distribution is quite uneven. Yeah. Australia is a frontline state in terms of planetary climate system, so it's more vulnerable and it gets affected more.
It reminds me of one of the things I was thinking through the way you write about Kant, and one of the things that Kant will say, along with other romantics, is that when we experience thunderstorms that are so violent, we think of them as sublime. This is the very definition of the sublime, because we're sheltered from them, because we are, in the end, we're stronger than, as human beings, we're superior. And this becomes the argument of human exceptionalism over nature. Right. But in situations like Hurricane Sandy, I mean, we had it in New York, or you mentioned cyclones, firestorms, and so on. There is an experience of not having control over nature and not having shelter from it. And I think that's a real shift in the way we
There's a
think.
there's a very telling and sad story that comes out of Australian firestorms of 2019-20, where the government decided to cull 10,000 feral camels because they were competing for water with a particular group of humans in Central Australia. That kind of shows that when you're faced with planetary fury, you just your politics is reduced to that of survival. I mean, you're just one biological creature competing with another biological creature for the same thing.